Wow, it's been a while since I've been on this podcast, so I'm going to start this off with a bit of an apology, I guess. I guess fortunately, there probably isn't anybody that actually listens to this week on week. So in reality, if you're listening to this, it probably just looks like another episode. I thought it would be relevant to give a little bit of context as to the delay. I think I've made a previous episode on kind of trying to make the business sense to create content and actually spend time in business in the alternative protein space. And I guess my failure in doing that. So that's been interesting, and I hope that the business climate in this environment changes for anyone else that's listening to this at the time they're listening to this. But ultimately, a man's got to make money. So I've been distracted with other business pursuits. So that's one thing. A motivator, and I don't know how many months it's been since I've actually made an episode on this podcast. But a motivator for me is recently my dog passed away, and yesterday actually, and she was one of the reasons why in a roundabout way why I even am interested in this topic, and why it got me actually making this podcast. And I one of the reasons for me delaying making this was very much because lack of time to produce this and get this out. And I realized to myself, really, that's just bullshit, because most, if not all, of my content that I've made is just one take. I just do it, record, and just put it out there. But it does take time to edit it and learn how to edit it and post it and all that other shit. So I guess this is a bit of a warning to anybody listening to this content forward, that for the foreseeable, this content will be very much minimal viable product. And if you look at some of my previous content, you're probably thinking, well, shit, I thought that was MVP. Well, no, this is bare bones. I'm just going to hit record, just going to put this content out there, because reality is nobody really listens to this, nobody really watches this right now, and really that's not the purpose of this. This is all about me just like tracking my journey and keeping me accountable to actually learn about this subject. And really nobody's watching this or listening to this for the video editing content and all of that shit. So that's reason number one. Excuse number two is the actual topic that I kind of got stuck on. So I spent a lot of time reading and trying to understand about cell lines, which is part of the topic of this video. And I just found it was really quite a complex subject for me as a layman to understand, get my head around. Lots of different terminologies, lots of different resources using different terminologies and explaining the concept in different ways. And often, with my own kind of journey, I often have to read other topics, not specifically about cultivated meat, for me to kind of get my understanding. Often I'm reading things, aimed at 12-year-olds for their kind of high school education biology, for me to kind of get my head around these concepts. So there's a lot of like piecing together, and I just found with this particular topic, there was a lot of that. And actually, I found that it would be quite complicated even for me, really, to put this all in one video as an explainer, because really a big motivation for me in putting this content out there is for those going through a similar journey to be able to watch this and save them a load of time, basically. So I actually think breaking this topic of cell lines into a number of videos would be better, and that's what I'm aiming to do. I haven't worked out how many videos, but I think I'd like to make this a series of episodes with different aspects that kind of contribute to cell lines in cultivated meat production. But the idea would be that each video is kind of a standalone topic that could be watched or listen to exclusively, but to get maximum value, let's say, like, you want to probably watch each one in series. And my aim is that, once you watch that, at least you got a basic idea of what the hell a cell line is. Okay, so this first video, I wanted to introduce this concept of starter cells. So that's kind of what this one is going to be about. And I'll get to kind of defining what I mean by starter cells in a second. But as usual, we want to start with some maybe like fundamentals first, to create context around what starter cells are and how they link to kind of cell lines. So the fundamentals I want to kind of consider or look at is looking at conventional meat product. So if we look at a piece of chicken or something like that, with conventional meat, it's composed of 3 key components, and you would have heard of those. Probably the first 2, muscle and fat, but you've also got connective tissue. So muscle, connective tissue, and fat are the kind of 3 key components that a meat product would be made of. Each of those components provide different characteristics, let's say, of the meat. So muscle is the primary mass of a meat, of a piece of meat, and it provides the sort of texture that you get with meat. Connective tissue also provides characteristics of texture with the meat, but also the structure of the meat. It comes down a lot to the connective tissue that we and animals have in their body. Fat is the third component that, again, I mentioned. You would have heard when you're looking at meat or eating meat, and fat is responsible for essentially like the taste, the juiciness, like the mouthfeel of when you're actually eating the meat. So combined, all of those 3 components are what really creates meat and creates that product that so many of us love and are addicted to. And ultimately, when we're looking at cultivated meat, essentially the cultivated meat process is, or the challenge, or the thing that the producers are trying to do when making cultivated meat, is reproduce these 3 key characteristics within meat, but do it without the use of an animal, essentially. Now, I think it's important to add that in the cultivated meat process, because obviously in the body it kind of happens as the body is reproducing and growing, but in the cultivated meat production process, as previous videos have explored, the bioreactor is kind of the main process that is involved in the creation of cultivated meat. Okay, something that I used to think when I was kind of looking from a very outside perspective as cultivated meat is, and I've said this before about this idea of like the meat just coming out of the bioreactor or coming out of the machine as like one finished product. Now, as I get into this more and more, that is definitely not the case. But like zooming into this concept, I think something that's important to grasp is the producers are not producing fat, meat, connective tissue all in one like process. Actually, what's happening is these are all made individually, and then in a further processing, these are actually all combined to create a meat-like product, essentially. So the reason that I think that is important is if we go back to those 3 core components of cultivated meats: the muscle, the fat, the connective tissue. Each of them have different properties and different characteristics that they add to the meat. So in some ways, you need to know what part of the which of those 3 you're actually trying to create first, in order to then look back at the step before and work out, okay, what source cells am I going to use to create those end product cells that we're going to consume. So this is where this concept of starter cells comes from. So starter cells are essentially I kind of think of it as like the base ingredient, like the input ingredient that you're putting in order to get that end product. So once we know what end product characteristic cell we want to make, we can then step back and look at, okay, what starter cell particularly do we need in order to make a fat cell, to make a connective tissue cell, to make a muscle cell. And we'll explore in further videos, actually, you can have certain starter cells that can actually achieve all or both. When looking at starter cells, there are two key characteristics that all starter cells that are used for cultivated meat have. And you'll hear these terms a lot: the ability to differentiate and the ability to proliferate are basically two key characteristics that any starter cell has to have. So to help understand the subject of cultivated meat, I've always found to try and find like similarities or key properties, and you'll hear, as I said, you'll hear these terms a lot. So I think it's important that we kind of redefine these and try and put some context into sort of cell line starter cells. So firstly, differentiation. So differentiation is the ability for a young unspecialized cell to be able to change into a specialized cell with a specific role in the body. Okay, so this happens all the time in our bodies, where there's certain cells that provide certain functions in our body. Now, the muscle, connective tissue, the fat cells that we are consuming if we eat meat are specialized cells. Okay, so in that sense, it's important that whatever starter cell we use to create the specialized cells actually have that ability to create them, if that makes sense. They have to be able to differentiate. Now, the second key principle is proliferation, or not principle, the second key characteristic, I should say, is proliferation. So starter cells must have the ability to proliferate. Proliferation is basically the ability of these starter cells to multiply and divide in number. And that's an important characteristic as well, because at the end of the day, you need to have the ability for the meat to grow to a substantial mass. So you need to create, or you need to you be using the cell that can actually, as I said, grow and multiply in order to make it like a financially sustainable endeavor when you're making meat. So that's the end of the first part of this series on cell lines. So just to summarize what we covered off today, you've got conventional meat, and it's made of three key components: muscle, fat, and connective tissue. Okay, combined, the components of all three of those is what creates meat as a product. So cultivated meat as a process, we're basically trying to replicate the production of one of those three. Starter cells are the cells that you would use in order to create one of those three components of meat. And any starter cell that you're using for cultivated meat production is going to have the ability to differentiate and proliferate. So those are two key characteristics. Thanks.